from Georgia. Meanwhile, the E administration's decision to draw back a controversial capital gains tax hike proposal for stock investments drove the local bourse to a fresh high on this Monday. And plans are in the works to supply the market with 15 key grocery items in time for the Chuseok holiday in early October and to spend 50 billion Korean won on discounts to ease the burden on purse strings. U.S. President Donald Trump is seeking to restore confidence among foreign investors following the recent detention and consequent departure of hundreds of South Korean engineers and technicians from the Hyundai plant in Georgia. Lee Seung-jae has our top story.
U.S. President Donald Trump is seeking to reassure foreign investors after the mass detention of South Korean workers in Georgia raised fresh concerns about America's credibility as a reliable business partner. In a social media post Sunday, Trump said he does not want to frighten off or disincentivize foreign investment. He stressed that companies building advanced products like semiconductors, ships, and batteries are welcome in the U.S., and that he wants them to bring skilled workers to train Americans. Trump added that U.S. workers would eventually do even better than their counterparts abroad. The comments come just days after 316 South Korean workers were detained during an immigration raid at an electric vehicle battery plant construction site in Bryan County, Georgia. The plant is a joint venture between Hyundai Motor Group and LG Energy Solution. The workers were detained for a week before returning home on Friday. The incident sparked anger in South Korea, prompting diplomatic intervention. On Sunday, U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Christopher Landau met with Seoul's first Vice Foreign Minister Park Yoon-ju in Seoul. According to Seoul's Foreign Ministry, Landau expressed deep regrets over the detention and vowed to prevent similar cases in the future. He conveyed that President Trump is personally following the issue and promised that the detained workers will not face disadvantages if they seek to re-enter the U.S. Landau also proposed working-level talks on visa procedures to better support South Korean firms investing in America. In response, Vice Minister Park raised concerns about the hardships endured by the detained workers and noted the strong sense of shock felt by the South Korean public. Both sides agreed that the incident should be used as an opportunity to strengthen bilateral ties and improve institutional safeguards for workers tied to major investment projects. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
And Seoul and Washington are engaged in follow-up negotiations to finalize the trade framework reached in late July, but talks are proving to be tough. Our Pyun Ye-young explains.
Trade talks between South Korea and the U.S. are set to continue as Trade Minister Yeo Han-gu leaves for the U.S. on Monday to meet with the United States Trade Representative Jamieson Greer. Industry Minister Kim Jong-un returned home the previous day after follow-up discussions with U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick on the trade agreement reached in July. Under that deal, the U.S. had agreed to cut reciprocal tariffs from 25% to 15% in exchange for Seoul pledging investment worth $350 billion. But follow-up talks have proven difficult. U.S. officials are demanding that Korea increase the share of direct investment, allow Washington to select where the funds are invested, and concede 90% of the profits to the United States. For Seoul, such terms are seen as unfair. The presidential office has reiterated that no hasty decision will be made at the expense of the nation's interest.
The president has previously described Korea's stance as defensive. We are conducting negotiations with the aim of protecting national interests to the fullest.
The presidential office also explained that the negotiations are not aimed at a single fixed goal, but involve both sides presenting new conditions in search of balance, making the talks highly variable. Japan, a key rival in automobiles, struck a deal with Washington in early September, adding pressure on Seoul. Tokyo agreed to invest $550 billion under terms set by the U.S., including project selection and a 90% profit share. In return, tariffs on Japanese cars fall to 15% from September 16th, putting Korean exporters at a disadvantage. With the talks at a standstill, attention now turns to President Lee Jae-myung's upcoming trip to the UN General Assembly in New York later this month, which could provide another opportunity for another summit with President Trump. Pyongyang, Arirang News.
Hyundai Engineering and Construction has won a deal worth over $3.1 billion to build a seawater treatment plant in Iraq. The project is reportedly part of the Iraqi government-led Common Seawater Supply Project, an initiative aimed at injecting seawater into oil reservoirs to boost crude oil output in Iraq's southern oil fields. The construction is expected to be completed within 49 months. This new deal marks Hyundai E&C's largest project in Iraq since the company's completion of a $6 billion oil refinery in Karbala back in the year 2023. The government's decision to draw back a controversial capital gains tax hike proposal for stock investments drove the local bourse to yet another fresh high on this Monday. Our Park Jun-an covers this latest rally and more.
The decision by the government to maintain the major shareholder threshold for capital gains tax at 5 billion Korean won, or around $3.6 million, has fueled the KOSPI rally. Adding momentum to its record-breaking streak for a fourth straight session, the KOSPI closed above the 3,400 mark on Monday for the first time in its history. The market had temporarily stalled since July after news that proposed tax reform would slash the capital gains tax threshold for major shareholders to 1/5 of its current level. But stocks started to bounce back after President Lee Jae-myung suggested last Thursday that the measure might be revised.
야당도 요구하고 또 여당도 또 그냥 놔두면 좋겠다는 의견이고 저한테 메시지도 막 많이 오고 그런 걸 봐서는 굳이 뭐 50억을 10억으로 내리자 반드시 그렇게 해야 되겠다 그렇게 생각하지는 않습니다.
After President Lee publicly addressed the possibility of leaving the threshold unchanged, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Economy and Finance Koo Yoon-chul confirmed the government's decision to maintain the current level.
There was considerable deliberation regarding the major shareholder threshold for the capital gains tax on stock transfers. Officials weighed the need for fair taxation against the goal of supporting and energizing the capital market. After considering both public opinion and the party's position, the government decided to keep the threshold at 5 billion won.
The professor of economics said the decision to leave the tax threshold unchanged brought stability to the stock market.
From the perspective of stock investors, maintaining the 5 billion won threshold means holdings below this level remain unaffected, helping to stabilize stock prices. By keeping the threshold, the administration has also encouraged investors who previously considered selling to hold on to their positions, which positively impacts the stock market.
Now, attention is focused on stabilizing foreign exchange rates and the upcoming U.S. Federal Reserve interest rate decision, as well as the U.S. Fed's future guidance that could impact global stock markets. Park Jun-an, Arirang News.
Efforts are underway to stabilize grocery prices in time for the Chuseok holiday, which falls on Monday, October 6th this year. Our correspondent Shin Ha-young has details.
Ahead of the Korean version of the Thanksgiving holiday Chuseok, the government and the ruling party are rolling up their sleeves with ways to help ease grocery costs. The plan was announced on Monday at a meeting between the administration and the Democratic Party.
Rising prices during the holiday season shouldn't be taken for granted. We hope the government's plan to supply record amounts of vegetables, meat, and other essentials goes smoothly. The party's price task force will track price drivers from production and work on fundamental solutions on the ground.
As part of the efforts, the government is increasing the supply of key grocery items for Chuseok, including apples, pears, and chestnuts, to a record 172,000 tons.
We will boost the supply of 15 key grocery items and spend a record 50 billion Korean won on discounts to help lower people's grocery bills.
After the meeting, the DP said that the government will also provide an additional 25,000 tons of rice to stabilize prices, while vulnerable groups will be eligible for a 20% discount. To boost domestic consumption, the government will issue 150,000 accommodation coupons for use in special disaster zones that have been heavily hit by natural disasters. Highway tolls will be waived for 4 days starting October 4th, and KTX and SRT train tickets for travelers from the provinces to the capital area during the Chuseok holiday will be discounted by up to 40%. The government will also spend a record 43.2 trillion won, or about $31 billion, to provide greater support for small business owners as well as small and mid-sized companies. Meanwhile, the DP called for thorough preparations to avoid confusion over the government's second round of livelihood recovery consumption coupons, which will begin accepting applications next Monday, with the government pledging to do its best for a smooth rollout. 신하영, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, applications start today for the government's nationwide payback program that reimburses consumers for part of their credit card spending. In a bid to boost spending and support small businesses, the 3-month program offers monthly refunds of up to 100,000 won, or roughly $74, for adults whose card spending has surpassed their monthly average spending in 2024. All residents of age who used a credit or debit card last year are eligible to apply, including foreign residents. Applications will remain open until November 30th, while payouts begin October 15th. Refunds will be issued in the form of digital gift certificates valid for 5 years and are capped at 300,000 won over 3 months. South Korea's ICT exports jumped over 11% on-year last month, driven by greater demand for AI-related chips. Our correspondent Moon Ji-young covers the latest findings.
South Korea's ICT exports last month achieved record-breaking August figures, driven by record-high chip sales despite U.S. tariffs. According to data released by the Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy on Sunday, ICT exports in August totaled over $22.8 billion, up 11.1% year-on-year. Semiconductor exports, the largest export engine, surpassed $15 billion, marking a 27% increase. The record-breaking performance was driven by the rising contract prices of memory chips and robust demand for high-performance memory products such as HBM and DDR5, fueled by the expansion of AI servers and data centers.
Currently, the impact of U.S. tariff policies isn't prominently affecting semiconductors, so we need to consider that aspect separately. AI semiconductors come in various types, and Korea's HBM is integrated into those AI systems. Given HBM's exceptionally high unit price, it's significantly driving our current export boost, and we expect this upward trend to continue.
In contrast, display exports saw a decline due to sluggish demand in front-end industries like TVs, monitors, and mobile devices. Mobile phone exports also experienced an overall decrease as the slowdown in component exports outweighed the strong performance of new finished product exports. Exports of computers and peripherals also fell, largely influenced by the sharp increase in SSD exports the year before, creating a high base effect. Among major markets to see an increase were Vietnam, up 18%, and the European Union with a rise of 8.2%, while Taiwan saw a particularly strong surge of over 65%. Japan and China also saw increased exports. Exports to the U.S., however, were down by 9.9%. Meanwhile, ICT imports totaled over $12.5 billion, resulting in a positive ICT trade balance. Moon Ji-young, Arirang News.
President Lee Jae-myung has vowed to do away with the burdensome bureaucracy against new businesses. Do take a listen.
거미줄처럼 규제들이 얽혀 있는데 이런 거미줄 규제를 좀 과감하게 확 걷어내자라는 게 우리 이번 정부의 목표입니다. 또 필요하다면 법제화를 포함해서 강력한 추진력을 가지고
진행을 해볼 생각입니다.
Speaking at a strategy meeting for regulatory reform, the first of its kind under the new government on this Monday, the president also addressed ways to streamline regulations in AI, self-driving vehicles and robots. Also on the table today was the broader task of facilitating corporate growth. Foreign Minister Cho Hyun is scheduled to sit down with his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi in Beijing this week. According to the Foreign Ministry here, Cho will depart for a two-day trip this coming Wednesday to mark the first top diplomats meeting between Seoul and Beijing under the Lee Jae-myung administration. On the agenda are prospects of Chinese President Xi Jinping's presence at the APEC leaders meeting in Gyeongju and ways to advance the two countries' strategic partnership. President Lee Jae-myung has appointed attorney Cha Ji-hoon as South Korea's ambassador to the United Nations. Cha previously served as legal counsel to Seongnam City and was part of Lee's defense team in a 2020 election-related lawsuit that ended in an acquittal. Unlike other ambassadorships, the UN post does not require host country approval, so Cha is expected to take up his post in New York soon. The Lee Jae-myung administration's first National Assembly interpellation kicked off today. The four-day session sees lawmakers question government officials on a wide range of issues, starting with politics on this Monday. Foreign affairs will be addressed on Tuesday, the economy on Wednesday, and culture as well as education on Thursday. The ruling Democratic Party is expected to focus on its legislative agenda, emphasizing the people's livelihoods and the need for reform, while the main opposition People Power Party has declared its intention to use the Q&A session to grill officials on the new government's policies. Now, advances in artificial intelligence are aggravating the digital divide, and while plans are in the works to address this concern, pundits say much more needs to be done. Our Eun-jin files this report.
As technology continues to advance by the day, difficulties inevitably grow for the elderly as they become digitally marginalized. The rural town of Gwaninmyeon in Pocheon City has the highest proportion of elderly residents in Gyeonggi-do Province. Accordingly, Pocheon City has been running an AI community center for seniors since December 2024. The program helps the elderly use common digital devices like kiosks and card readers.
I didn't know how to use it, so I used to just watch from afar and walk away. But now I want to step forward and try things myself, like making payments on my own. I've gained the confidence that it's not just for young people, and that feels great.
For that reason, some local governments are showing interest in providing digital education for vulnerable groups, but efforts remain far from sufficient. As much as AI technologies are developing and spreading quickly, the elderly and people with disabilities are left behind, still struggling to use even basic digital services. According to a recent survey by the National Information Society Agency on the digital gap, only 51% of the general population had experience using AI, whereas that number dropped to around 30% for vulnerable groups such as the elderly, disabled, and low-income individuals. The more AI technology advances, these marginalized populations are being left further behind, widening that gap.
Digital devices are a challenge, so I don't really use them. I don't even use a card. It just seems a bit difficult.
In December of last year, the National Assembly passed the Digital Inclusion Act, which guarantees universal access to digital technologies. This means that both national and local governments are now required to develop policies ensuring that everyone in society can benefit from digital technology without discrimination. However, this currently remains largely symbolic, and more concrete practical policies and support measures are needed.
In order for everyone to equally enjoy the benefits of a digital society, we need to promote the current policies more widely so that all citizens are aware of them.
As the Lee Jae-myung administration aims to make South Korea one of the world's top 3 AI powers, it must not only focus on technological competitiveness, but will need to implement policies and institutional support so that digitally vulnerable populations are not left behind. 이은진, Arirang News.
On the entertainment front, director Park Chan-wook's No Other Choice has won the International People's Choice Award at this year's Toronto International Film Festival. Now, this is a new award that is determined by the vote of the viewing public. Separately, the highly coveted People's Choice Award went to director Chloe Zhao's adaptation of Hamlet titled Hamnet. Meanwhile, Park's latest big screen production, No Other Choice, will hit theatres here in South Korea next week.
This is The World Now, bringing you the latest stories from around the globe. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio arrived in Israel on Sunday and met with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to discuss the war in Gaza and last week's Israeli airstrike in Qatar. Upon arrival on Sunday morning, Rubio and Netanyahu visited the Western Wall in Jerusalem's Old City, accompanied by the U.S. ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee. The two said through a joint prayer ceremony that their alliance remains as strong and durable as the stones of the Western Wall. Though Rubio criticized the recent Israeli strike in Qatar, saying the United States was not happy, he emphasized that it will not change the nature of the U.S.-Israel relationship. Plans for Gaza and securing the return of hostages are to be discussed. Rubio will then join President Trump on his planned visit to Britain next week. Romania has condemned a Russian drone incursion, described as the second violation of NATO airspace within a week. The Romanian Defense Ministry confirmed on Saturday that its air defenses had tracked a Russian-made drone for almost an hour as it entered its airspace in the southeastern county of Tulcha. Detected near the Ukrainian border, the drone flew low and stayed in Romanian airspace for about 15 minutes before exiting near the village of Chilia-Veche, dropping off radar about 20 kilometers southwest of that point. Romania scrambled fighter jets and enlisted the support of Eurofighter jets from its NATO allies. However, the drone was not shot down as it was not considered an immediate threat. The incident comes days after Poland shot down Russian drones that had violated its airspace, prompting NATO allies to pledge to strengthen defenses. Iran's Supreme National Security Council on Sunday approved the agreement between Iran and the International Atomic Energy Agency to resume inspections of nuclear facilities. The Council reviewed and approved the agreement recently concluded between Iran's foreign minister and the IAEA Director General in Cairo, Egypt on September 9th. Following attacks on its nuclear facilities by Israel and the United States in June, Iran had restricted IAEA inspectors from visiting these sites. However, under the new deal, Iran is required to report on nuclear material at the affected sites and permit IAEA access to all nuclear installations. Iran said the agreement can be terminated if any hostile action occurs against Iran or its nuclear facilities. In the UK, former world boxing champion Ricky the Hitman Hatton has died at the age of 46. His body was discovered early on Sunday morning at his home in Greater Manchester. Police said his death is not being treated as suspicious. Hatton's boxing career spanned from 1997 to 2012, winning titles in both the light welterweight and welterweight divisions. He earned 45 wins in 48 professional fights. Following his retirement, Hatton struggled with mental health, alcoholism, and addiction. After his death, tributes poured in, with the World Boxing Association saying he was a true champion and a legend of the sport. Cha Ji-hoon, Arirang News.
It is cool in the morning and evening, but the heat continues in the middle of the day. Heat wave advisories were issued for the coastal areas of Jeju Island, Jeollanam-do and Gyeongsangnam-do provinces today. The daytime temperature in Seoul rose to 30 degrees Celsius and it was 33 degrees in Daegu. This late summer heat will ease off after it rains across the country on Wednesday. After showers across the country tomorrow, it will start raining in the central and western parts of the country late at night and will spread across the country on Wednesday. Tomorrow, Seoul, Daejeon, Gwangju, and Daegu will start off at 23 degrees. Daily highs will go up to 29 degrees in Chuncheon, 33 degrees in Daegu and Gyeongju. After the rain stops, the morning temperature in Seoul will drop to 19 degrees on Thursday, and the daytime temperature in Seoul will only reach 24 degrees on Friday. That's all for Korea. Here are the weather conditions around the world.
Right, those are the headlines at this hour here in South Korea. As always, thank you for watching.
Building a sustainable tomorrow. Connect, innovate, and prosper. Connecting goods to goods, region to region, people to people, generation to generation. Facilitating innovation for all, closing the digital divide. Building an inclusive technology ecosystem, promoting digital innovation by deepening dialogues on AI. Achieving shared prosperity, addressing global challenges. Energy transition, climate change, population decline, and pandemic responses. APEC-related events continuing in Seoul, the capital of the Republic of Korea, where diverse cultures blend. Jeju, the beautiful island, blessed with UNESCO Natural World Heritage Sites. Incheon, the vibrant international city, central hub, connecting Asia Pacific. Busan, the largest maritime city, centering around maritime trade and the logistics industry. And Gyeongju, the city hosting the APEC Economic Leaders Meeting, where 2,000 years of profound history and modern, trendy, and youthful energy blend in a perfect balance. Here, a new chapter of economic exchanges will unfold for a better future.
that is September 15th, marks the International Day of Democracy. And in light of this occasion, on Press Perspective today, we delve into the state of democracy here and elsewhere. Hello, hope you had a good weekend. It's Monday, September 15th here in Seoul, and you're watching Press Perspective. So, is global democracy on a decline? That is the question we touch upon today. For more on this, I have Thomas Marska with American news agency UPI here in the studio. Thomas, welcome back.
Thanks, great to be here.
I also have Stephen Barak with Japanese weekly news magazine Nikkei Asia here in the studio as well. Stephen, it's great to have you here.
Nice to see you as always.
Thomas, we will start with you. Let's start off then with some very basic information about the International Day of Democracy, including its founding as well as its purpose. Thomas.
Right, so it was first held in 2008 by the United Nations. It was established the year before, voted on by the United Nations General Assembly in 2007. So this year is the 18th edition. It's held every September 15th. Basically, it's, you know, one of these international days. They hold some events at the UN. I mean, it's promoted, it's seen as kind of an opportunity to review the state of democracy in the world. That's kind of the overarching view, and, you know, to just attempt to promote and uphold the principles of democracy worldwide, encourage governments to strengthen and consolidate democratic institutions. I mean, it kind of emerged out of, there's another group that's connected to the UN called the Inter-Parliamentary Union. That is a group, you know, a confederation kind of parliaments from around the world, and they had voted on a universal declaration of democracy in 1997. So it kind of, you know, emerged from that eventually. And, you know, there's just different themes each year. And this year they're calling it From Voice to Action. And it's, you know, I think there will be one event at the UN itself, like a panel discussion on September 15th in, you know, New York time. And just, you know, talking about shrinking civic space, disinformation, how to build trust and dialogue. That seems to be the theme this year. And, you know, like sort of like Earth Day or something, I mean, not to that extent, but there are other events that are held around the globe to mark it. So, you know, that's basically what it is.
Right, and ahead of that event, Thomas, the head of the UN, Antonio Guterres, he did share a message with the world to mark this year's International Day of Democracy. What was that message and what were your takeaways?
So his message was very short this year, actually. I mean, he basically highlighted that you know, democracy thrives most when human rights and fundamental freedoms of all are upheld, especially the most vulnerable. He said, a democracy that excludes is no democracy at all. That was one of the main things he said. And he also kind of briefly pointed out that he grew up in a dictatorship in Portugal under the Salazar, and, you know, was involved with the transition from dictatorship to democracy in the 70s. And, you know, just basically said there's a big difference between the two. You know, in previous years, he's kind of elaborated more on what those differences are about, you know, this living in fear and suffering under a democracy, or under dictatorships. He didn't really talk that much about it this time, you know, and just sort of honored the courage of, you know, those fighting to uphold democracy. He said at a time when democracy and the rule of law are under assault from disinformation, division, and shrinking civic space, these efforts are more vital than ever. So, you know, I think my takeaway is, you know, clearly he's speaking to the moment. You know, I think, as we'll discuss, democracy is facing some serious challenges around the world. So he's speaking to that. And I think, you know, highlighting this idea of exclusion or inclusion as a key element seems to me, you know, maybe I'm seeing this from a perspective from the U.S., but, you know, I feel like some of the situations occurring there are kind of strengthening these ideas of in-groups and out-groups and, you know, kind of undesirable and true, you know, true democratic, you know, true American citizens, something like that. So I think, I don't know, maybe I'm just perceiving it, but it does feel like there's some sense of that being a message of, like, you know, we can't just have democracy for some and not others. I mean, those sorts of situations are happening around the world as well.
Right, and so, Stephen, as the world celebrates International Day of Democracy today, a report by the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance has been receiving quite a bit of media attention as it speaks about, as Thomas mentioned, a decline in democracy in recent years. Tell us a bit more about the findings within that report.
The main conclusion of the report, I think, is that democracy around the world has weakened, and the most kind of obvious way that we're seeing this is in a decline in press freedoms. Press freedoms are essential to a democracy in a number of ways. In one sense, that it's just, I think in recent years we've seen in a number of countries kind of authoritarian or authoritarian-leaning governments kind of go after the media first because it's kind of easy to depict journalists to a certain portion of the population as being like against their interests, as reflecting the interests of the elite or of outsiders or whatever it happens to be. Another thing that the report points to is reduced international support for democracy and for like democratic institution building. And I think a lot of that has to do with the cutbacks of aid by the Trump administration in the U.S. I mean, the United States for a very long time maintained things like Voice of America and USAID and all these institutions that existed on the premise that like it was in the interests of the United States to see democratic movements in countries around the world, that it made sense to encourage these groups and encourage the dissemination of information that would lead to kind of make it more likely that societies would be able to establish democratic practices like their own freedom of the press and their own elections and their own sort of institutional safeguards. The U.S. has really turned away from that. That's just something that the Trump administration has decided is, I guess, for a combination of reasons, just not in their interest. They don't see it as like a responsible use of U.S. taxpayer money. They don't think that the groups or the institutions that this money is going to are really in those countries' own best interests. There's a lot there, but like I would just say that, and Thomas just touched on part of this. I mean, I think something that's undermining democracy all over the world is that there are growing fissures within societies where a certain portion of a country's citizens like do not see their fellow citizens as worthy of holding basic democratic rights. They say like, well, those people over there, they cannot have freedom of speech because they will not use that right responsibly. And and if we allow them to build their own civic groups or have their own political parties or have their own movements, then that's ultimately going to undermine democracy as a whole. It's going to like undermine the well-being of a society as a whole. I mean, in South Korea just last year, when Yoon Suk-yeol attempted to instill martial law, the rationale that he gave to it was that the then opposition party was anti-democratic, that they were undermining democracy, that they were presenting a threat to democracy, and that in order to safeguard South Korea's liberal democratic system, he had to declare martial law. Now, we all know that that didn't work. But the reason I'm citing that example is because I just feel like it's symptomatic of this symptomatic, did I say that? Symbolic is what I meant to say, of this sort of growing sense of people within societies kind of losing sight of the idea that citizens are entitled to these rights in an almost inalienable way, that these are guaranteed by the Constitution or they're guaranteed by whatever institution, and that if you fail to see your fellow citizens as being entitled to enjoy these rights, then the entire democratic experiment can be imperiled.
Right. And speaking about South Korea, Stephen, the report by the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, what do the findings tell us about the state of democracy here in South Korea?
Well, first, I would just flag that the period that the report examines is from 2019 to 2024. So here in 2025, we have gotten a new government in power here in South Korea. The administration of President Lee Jae-myung took office in early June. So just for the sake of viewers' understanding, we need to just be clear that like what is said in this report is not necessarily a reflection of the current circumstances. But this report found a quite big and what I think they described as a fairly alarming decline in press freedoms. As we all know, when President Yoon was in power, he had a pretty antagonistic relationship with the press. He undertook some cuttings to different forms of media support, and him and then First Lady Kim Gun-hee kind of floated the possibility of even using the law to go after reporters who reported things that they thought were unfair or inaccurate. I believe that under Yoon there were some raids of independent media outlets who were investigating potential allegations of fraud or other various kinds of malfeasance by Yoon. But that's over now. I mean, democracy was exercised and the people of this country decided that they wanted a new government. So we'll have to hope that things can improve from here, and that hopefully, however, whether it's 5 years from now, the next time the report comes out, there'll be some good progress to share.
Right. And before we delve deeper into the state of democracy here in South Korea, Thomas, very quickly, with regard to the broader expression of freedom, Nepal has been making quite a bit of headlines in recent days. Could you walk us through the events unfolding in Nepal?
Yeah, so it was just 1 week ago. It sort of feels like it was longer ago, but there was the large-scale protest movement broke out. It's kind of being called Gen Z protests. It was driven by younger Nepali people in Kathmandu originally, and it kind of started. I mean, there had been this bubbling anger over kind of widespread political corruption, unemployment, sense of inequality, but really what sparked the massive protest was the government suddenly banned a bunch of social media platforms, like all the major ones: Facebook, YouTube, X, WhatsApp, and that just sparked massive outrage, protests. And it started sort of peacefully, but there was also a really, heavy police crackdown almost immediately, firing in the crowd. Something like 19 people, I think, died in the initial wave. And then the counter move by the protesters, more people joined, and they started burning several buildings. They set fire to the parliament, residences of top politicians, other public buildings, and basically forced Prime Minister KP Sharma Ali to step down. And it's basically settled down since then. I think the latest death toll is around 72, though. A lot of damage, a lot of death. An interim government was formed, and elections have been called for March 5th. So it's kind of, it's interesting to see, I mean, especially in contrast to this more general backsliding of democracy. Financial Times just had an article today talking about, this rise within Asia of these sort of youth-driven, democratic or at least kind of anti-corruption protest movements. And there was one in Indonesia quite recently. There was one in Bangladesh not too long ago, and Sri Lanka a couple of years ago. And they share a lot of similar characteristics. I was actually in Mongolia recently, and in June they had their own protest movement. It didn't turn violent, but so many of the same characteristics, like an anger at this, wealth and sort of inequality as almost flaunted by the ruling political classes, driven by the younger generations, and also driven by social media in an interesting way where, on some levels, we've seen social media kind of move from hopefully a tool of democracy and evening out the playing field to sort of being almost like a vehicle for the destruction of democracy or ripping apart societies. But this is something where, these kind of have been sparked by sharing, grown on social media, and they've also emerged in response to governments trying to suppress and crack down on social media. So I think these governments recognize the sort of potential and the power of it. Still, Nepal did something very heavy-handed about it and just sort of immediately shut everything down, which angered people. But it kind of complicates the narrative in some sense. I feel like there's, we're seeing some elements of the power still of social media to organize and, bring people together and even to expose. I mean, that a lot of these were driven by the youth, the children of the wealthy flaunting the children of political elites flaunting their wealth on Instagram. That's what happened in Mongolia. That's what happened in Nepal. They were calling them Nepo kids. That was like the hashtag there. So, we're seeing this kind of complication of that, and at least within Asia, and there's some characteristics of younger generations, overall the population and kind of entrenched older political classes. But we are seeing some counter movements, away that are pushing more towards perhaps democracy or more representation.
Right, and speaking, of course, about democracy, Stephen, back here in Seoul, former Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, he recently applauded South Korea's democratic resilience. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
But I was actually in the room when he spoke. I was covering this conference that he was appearing at, and as a fellow Canadian, I thought I would go and see what he had to say. I mean, resilience is something that I think I myself wrote an article in December about the resilience of Korean democracy, and that it had suffered this attempt at undermining it or overturning it, but because of the strength of the populace and because of the strength of institutions, it was able to push back and it was able to bend but not break. I just have to say before I go into what exactly Mr. Trudeau said, I was impressed by his skill as a politician in that he's able to like speak in these very long, very engaging sentences while being very inoffensive and, you know, being kind of short on facts, but nevertheless telling a good story. So, but he said a few things that I thought were interesting. I mean, he flagged that the rule-based order and democracy and everything that comes with it has delivered a lot of peace and a lot of prosperity and a lot of stability over the past 80 years. And he said, what we must build now is resilience. And if you read between the lines of that, I think it's reasonable to ask, like, is the emphasis on resilience, does that come from an acknowledgement of the reality that it's in the world we live in today, it's harder than ever to build prosperity. It's harder than ever to maintain stability. In a lot of, some of the countries that Thomas just mentioned, these over the past, 30 or so years with globalization, with mechanization, with increased living standards, material conditions have improved a lot in a lot of places. There's a lot of people who have been pulled out of poverty, but are a lot of these countries going to be able to take that next step and get out of the kind of middle income trap in countries like South Korea or Japan, countries that experienced a lot of high growth for a very long time? Are they going to be able to maintain that growth, or going to be able to find new growth engines? It seems to me like a lot of the anger at the elites and a lot of the kind of the way that democracy has lost some of its luster is that in a lot of places of the world, they've had democratic political systems for a long time, but those systems have not delivered on the continually rising living standards that in some places people have come to expect. You have more and more people going to university and developing impressive credentials, but then later on finding that they're not able to attain the kind of middle class comforts that they had come to expect or that they had been dreaming of. So I wonder if, Mr. Trudeau did not come out and say that, but I wonder if, as he points out, resilience is going to be an increasingly important thing for democracies because they're going to face more and more sustained challenges. And that will be an area where I think South Korea could be instructive to the world because it has faced a lot of challenges. And if I could just go back again to that night in December, I remember being on my way to the National Assembly right after martial law had been declared. And in the uncertainty, the kind of nervousness of that moment, I remember feeling a little bit reassured, a little bit, not my worries were tempered by the fact that I knew that this country has a very resilient political culture, and I knew that there's a lot of people in this country who fought very hard for democracy and who were going to rise up and meet this challenge. And that's what we all saw, and South Korea's democracy did demonstrate its resilience, and I think it will continue to do so.
Right, good to know. I was actually going to ask you about the state of South Korea's democracy in your view, but you've answered that, so I'm going to move on to...
I could keep talking about it.
Right, but actually, I'm interested quite a bit, Thomas, with regard to specific countries then. The International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance claimed that the U.S. has been witnessing democratic backsliding under the Trump administration. Could you tell us a bit about the concerns shared within that report and what your takeaways are?
Yes, so, as Stephen mentioned earlier, that report only went through the end of 2024, basically, but they, had specifically noted in the sort of introduction that the first half of 2025 under the Trump administration has seen the U.S., basically, yes, as you said, do a backslide. They mentioned that between January and April, their organization issued 20 alerts, which is twice as many as in any of the previous 2 full years, documenting instances of the erosion of democratic norms in the U.S. And this is talking about these moves to restrict academic freedom, criminalize protest activity, question the legitimacy of certified elections, restrict media access to the executive branch, things we've seen them do. And they mentioned also, I think as Stephen talked about, how the U.S. has pulled back from a lot of its support for, global diplomatic promotion, engagement. And so, the takeaway, is that basically they said this really helps to underscore the extent to which, this radical uncertainty about the future of democracy is this is heightened by the, actions of the Trump administration. And they also mentioned that it's kind of a reminder of the danger inherent in assuming that the work of democracy is ever done, and that's a message we've seen. I mean, Guterres' statement mentioned that as well, and this idea that democracy is a process. I think that is just a constant message that it's being underscored with democracy, democracies around the world in general, and certainly what we saw in Korea gives you one example, perhaps, of how countries can respond to the attempted erosion of that. I was thinking of Brazil with Bolsonaro. He attempted something similar as the January 6th attempt by Trump supporters, but Brazil recently sentenced him to jail. So I mean, it's obviously for global future of democracy. It's not, I think, positive to think that the U.S. is stepping back from this role that it has held for a long time. I mean, there's a lot within the U.S. to also be concerned about, I think. But globally, yeah, it's something that it's a big void that the U.S. seems to be trying to leave, and we'll see if other places can kind of step into that.
Right, and speaking about the U.S., Stephen, political violence in that country has been raising quite a bit of concern. The recent very shocking assassination of activist Charlie Kirk has been condemned by leaders worldwide. If I were to ask you, Stephen, to point to one perhaps cause of the rising political violence in the U.S., what would you choose to highlight?
It's hard to narrow it down to just one thing, but I would just say that a lot of political theorists will point out that it's violent rhetoric that then leads to violent acts. That it's like in normalizing and in increasingly circulating either threats of violence or justifications for violence that then has a trickle-down effect where there is somebody out there who acts on it. It tends to be someone who is maybe disengaged in some areas of their life, possibly suffering from mental health issues. But there's a lot of things that we could say. I mean, we're living in an era where the dissemination of information is more powerful than ever, while there is less and less, moderation of this or fact-checking or testing the waters of whether or not this information is accurate, or maybe trying to tame down some of the more inflammatory stuff. So, I mean, I was really shocked by the recent assassination, and I kept thinking back to the assassination of the health insurance executive, the Louis Mangoni case, just because when that happened, I think a lot of people, myself included, were surprised at how many people were going out of their way to kind of justify what this young man had done. This was a very brutal and a very calculated murder, but there were some people who were saying, well, you have to understand why he did this. The victim in this attack was someone who had denied the right to life to other people, and you reap what you sow and all this other kind of stuff. So I do wonder if what we saw last week in the case of Charlie Kirk was a kind of copycat act, in the sense that Mangoni became a kind of cult hero, became a kind of figure of adulation in some circles, became kind of, not even kind of, became famous. And when somebody does something like, when somebody departs from normal human norms of acts and decorums and is not shunned for it, they are celebrated in some cases. That's inevitably going to inspire some kind of fringe acts that are similar. So, like a lot of people, I'm worried at the prospect that what we saw with Charlie Kirk could be a kind of tipping point and could lead to even more violence and kind of lead to violence as a tactic of political interchange being that much more normalized. I mean, the really sad part, I mean, there's a lot that's sad about it, but one really sad part of what happened to Charlie Kirk was that when he was killed, he was engaging in the most basic act of political discourse. He was in a public place and he was debating. And regardless of what you think of the guy's politics, I mean, you have to, in this age where people do not get together in person and talk all that much, you have to at least I do, admire his willingness that he would go out in person and he would talk to whoever wanted to talk to him. And he specifically sought out the people who disagreed with him. And I know he wasn't an angel in plenty. He said things that were questionable, but I do at least think that in a lot of his exchanges, he acted in a reasonably good faith manner and, you know, a cordial enough manner. And
he was willing to engage in political discourse.
Yes, and I hope that the legacy of what happened to him is not that we see a continuing shrinking of that.
Right, and also, of course, lawmakers across the aisle in the U.S. have condemned, of course, his killing. All right, I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Stephen, as always, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Thomas, thank you very much for your thoughts.
Thanks.
Right, on that note, we end Monday's edition of Press Perspective. Thank you for watching. Do join us again same time tomorrow.
천년을 이어온 우리의 지혜가 제천에서 다시 태어났어. 세대를 관통한 선조들의 건강 빅데이터. 빅데이터. 우리의 삶과 들에서 자란 천연물은 단순한 재료